In this episode, I'd like to give you my thoughts on why I think it's important to catalog your images, and maybe from a different point of view than what you've heard before. Welcome to another video. A couple of years ago, a good friend of mine who was a pretty prolific photographer passed away. I've mentioned him in a couple of my other videos. My buddy Tom, he was my photography mentor. And when he passed away, I ended up having the responsibility of being the executor of his will. And one of my responsibilities was to find something to do with all his negatives and his prints. And you would think that would be a pretty easy task. Now, before he passed away, we talked about what he wanted to have done with them. And what he wanted to have done with them was to donate them to a photography school, or where he went to school, which was Ohio State University. Ohio State had no interest in taking on his negatives. I tried to find some other photographic schools, and unfortunately, unless your name is Ansel Adams and maybe a couple of different other photographers, people just aren't going to want your negatives. Sad but true. And even working with his family, they didn't know what to do with his negatives. So I ended up going through boxes and boxes of negatives, and I was fairly familiar with his work. He did have quite a few of his images printed out. He did a lot of platinum printing, and they were printed out and hung on his walls. Some of his images were sold in galleries. So again, I was pretty familiar with what his popular images were, and also what were his favorite images, even if they weren't the ones necessarily being sold in galleries. So I spent hours and hours of going through his negatives, putting them in sleeves, putting them in binders, and I got it narrowed down to, I think, 2 or 3 binders. Because, like I said, because he did platinum printing, and he did a lot of large format photography. He had 8x10 negatives, he had 4x5 negatives, he had 2x3 35mm negatives. So he had a lot to go through. And I took the task of going through them all and pulling them out. Despite even doing that, no one really wanted his negatives. I was willing to keep them. I ended up giving them to his daughter because I thought that was the right thing to do. I don't know what she did with them. And I don't know what she could do with them other than just put them on a shelf. I've mentioned before a couple of times, a few years back I had heart surgery and I had blood clots and I wasn't supposed to make it. Fortunately, here I am. But looking back on it at that time, had I passed on, no one would even been able to find a lot of my images. They're scattered on hard drives all over the place. The negatives I have, half of them I can't even find. So what I've started doing recently was going through and finding what I thought were my best images and cataloging them and putting them all on one hard drive. I recently bought a little external Samsung, I think it was, drive. And I cataloged them all on there. At least I'm in the process of cataloging them, putting them in folders, dating them, cataloging them by family pictures, travel pictures, bird pictures, sports pictures, so that they're easy to find, for me anyway. But again, when something happens to me, yes, they'll be on that hard drive, but what are people supposed to do with it? You know, who's going to want the hard drive? So what I began doing a few years ago, just because I started doing it, not because of this particular thought. My wife, and at the time my mother's passed on now, but my mother as well, they enjoyed getting a yearly book of my images And mostly what I only did was I put like family pictures in there of my grandkids. I might put a couple of images in there from that year's travels, but mostly they're of my grandkids and my kids, my family. I might put an occasional seascape in there, but every year it's a different book. And my wife loves it. My mom loved them, and now I make them for my sister. But surprisingly, the people who look at them the most are my grandkids. Almost every time they come over here, if they see the books, they want to go through them and look. And sometimes they don't even recognize themselves. So what I'm thinking is just rather than leaving a lot of images on a hard drive, are making particular books and cataloging them for, like I've mentioned, I'm heading off to Iceland. So when I get back, I may do a book on that trip. And I may go back and do a book on some of my other travels. And I may go back and do a book on all my spoonbills and heron photos, so that they're all in one place. And one of the beauty of the books is, and I'm not being sponsored by any company. This has nothing to do with that. But one of the beauty of the books are that you can go back and print more. So that if there's only one copy and for whatever reason one of my other kids or a grandkid wants some of the books, you can go and print them and you'll have them. And I think that that's a much better way of cataloging and having your images rather than stored in boxes of negatives. Now, granted, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, these options weren't really there the way they are now. So I think it's best to take advantage of the technology that we have now. And it's much easier, I think, to, store books. And I have more than just this, but let's say there's even 10. So you store 10 books on a bookshelf somewhere, and then people don't have to go trying to find images on a hard drive or going through old negatives. And you take the burden, I think, off of the other family members who may or may not want to see your images, but at least you have them available for them. I know with Tom, his family wanted his prints, but a lot of them were printed out, but they were in boxes, and I had to go through and sort them and then decide, okay, you get this one and you get this one and you get this one. And then, thankfully there wasn't a lot of arguing between the family members as to who got which one. And, I allowed them, if they really wanted a particular one, let them have that one. But it was still a burden on me to go ahead and do all that and to go through and make that effort. Whereas I think if they're all just in books, there's the book. And it's sitting on a shelf, and if you want to print more, you print more. So I don't know that it applies to just someone of my age. I think if you're starting out in photography, no matter what age you are, start doing that. Start making a reference of your photographs. And I think in time, I know even with these books that I've done now for the last maybe 5 or 6 years, I can see a change in my photography. And I think if you do that over the course of, 20 or 30 years of making books, you'll see your style change. You'll see your quality of your images change, I would think. It would be beneficial to you as well as to your family to have those memories. Again, maybe your family won't want them, but at least they'll be available to them. I also think it puts you in a happier place because you get to see your images as well. I will admit every once in a while I'll go and thumb through those books and there's images in there that I've forgotten about. Anyway, it's just a thought. I know a lot of people, they catalog your photos in Lightroom and other places and you put them on a hard drive. And even if you do like I'm doing now, of just cataloging them all on one hard drive and they're all in one place and it's very neat and organized, who's going to even know they're there, right? I mean, a book, you just pick it up and you see it. There it is. You have it. It's just something to think about. Thanks for watching. If you haven't done already, please like and subscribe. And until next time, take good care.